When we talk about why communist states collapsed, the conversation usually turns to outside forces, right? The Cold War, economic pressure from the West. But what if the biggest problems were actually baked into the system from the very beginning? That's what we're digging into today. Michael Parenti's really sharp analysis, Communism in Wonderland, from his book Blackshirts and Reds.
Look, we all know about the immense external pressures these countries were under. We're talking invasions, embargoes, a nonstop Cold War. But Parenti's whole point is to get us to look past all that for a second and ask a more uncomfortable question. What was going wrong inside the machine itself?
So, Parenti starts right at the economic heart of things, with this idea he calls rewarding inefficiency. And the argument is basically this. The core engine of the economy, central planning, became so twisted and so surreal that it started to actively work against the very progress it was supposed to be creating. So what was this engine? Central planning. It's a totally top-down system where the state calls all the shots on production. Now, Parenti gives it its due. In the early days, it was a beast. I mean, for rapid industrialization, like building the factories you need to fight off the Nazis, it was brutally effective. But he says that same rigidity, the thing that made it strong at first, later became its biggest flaw, a huge roadblock to the kind of innovation a modern consumer economy needs.
And you know, this wasn't just some critic from the outside saying this. This diagnosis came from the very top. By 1990, you have the leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, saying out loud that the system is broken. He's pointing to a management culture that was literally rejecting progress and creating just staggering amounts of waste.
So, why was it so broken? Well, let's look at the totally bizarre incentives Parenti lays out. For starters, managers would actually fight against new technologies because, hey, it might make their job obsolete. And if your factory actually got better and more efficient, your big reward was a higher, tougher quota. You were literally punished for doing a good job. And get this, spare parts were priced so low that factories actually lost money making them. So guess what? Nobody made them, and you could never find any. The whole system just cared about hitting quantity targets, not quality.
And here's a perfect little example of that Wonderland logic. Farmers got paid by the pound for their animals. So what's your incentive? It's to produce the heaviest pigs you can, which means fatter pigs. For the farmer, that makes total economic sense. But it had absolutely nothing to do with what people actually wanted to buy and eat.
All of this inefficiency created this really wild paradox at the center of these societies. Parenti calls it, fittingly, nobody minding the store.
You know, the perception we had in the West was of this all-seeing, all-powerful state with totalitarian control over every aspect of life. But Parenti argues that for the average person living there, the daily frustration was often the exact opposite, this shocking absence of responsible control. It felt like nobody was really in charge of anything.
And this feeling, this lack of accountability, it just seeped into every part of daily life. The maintenance guy wouldn't show up to fix your sink. An incredible 30% of all produce would just spoil before it ever got to a store. People were constantly complaining about rude salespeople, shoddy goods, and terrible hospital services. And kind of bubbling under all of it was this constant low-level corruption, with workers regularly swiping supplies from their state job to do a little private work on the side.
Okay, here's another one of those incentives that is just perfectly backwards. If you worked at a state-run restaurant, the absolute last thing you wanted was a restaurant full of happy customers. Why? Well, the worse your service was, the fewer people showed up. And the fewer people who showed up, the more food was left over for the staff to take home or, you guessed it, sell on the black market for a nice profit. And again, this was not some kind of big secret. Way back in 1979, Cuba's Raul Castro was publicly complaining about this exact thing. He talked about deliberate go-slows, where work crews would hit their easy quota by lunchtime and then spend the whole afternoon working at a private farm for their own personal gain. It just goes to show you how deep this problem of work discipline really went.
So you're living with all these daily frustrations, all these absurdities. What does that do to you psychologically? Well, that brings us to our next point, this growing habit of romanticizing the West.
I mean, just imagine the slow grind of it all. The endless lines for basic groceries, being on a 10-year waiting list just to buy a car. The housing shortages being so bad that grown adults often had to keep living with their parents, even after getting married. According to Parenti, these constant, daily struggles just wore people down and slowly chipped away at their belief in the whole socialist project.
And what happens when people get disillusioned with their own reality? They start to dream of another one. For a lot of people, especially the young and the intellectuals, The West became the shimmering, idealized consumer paradise. It was a fantasy land of endless stuff to buy, endless choices, and a kind of excitement that felt like the ultimate forbidden fruit.
But, and this is a really big but, Parentini is quick to point out the harsh reality check. He notes that many of the people who actually made it to the West ended up being profoundly disillusioned. They were shocked by the poor social services, the high crime rates, the brutal work conditions. And ironically, they found themselves missing that sense of community, that social safety net that they had completely taken for granted back home. The paradise wasn't quite what they imagined.
So, on one hand, you've got this inefficient, frustrating system at home. On the other, you've got this idealized, romantic vision of what life is like somewhere else. And this clash created an impossible tension, a massive gap between expectations and reality. And this really gets us to the core conflict. On one side, the socialist system did provide real securities, a guaranteed job, housing, free education, free healthcare. On the other side, capitalism seemed to offer this endless buffet of consumer goods and personal choice. And so this impossible expectation was born, the idea that you could have it all. People wanted to keep all the security of socialism, but just, add all the consumer goodies of capitalism right on top.
This leads Parenti to a fascinating, kind of tragic conclusion. In a weird way, this system became a victim of its own success. Think about it. It took these poor agrarian countries and dragged them into the modern world, improving life for millions of people. But in doing that, it created a new generation with much higher expectations for what a good life should look like. And those were expectations that its own clunky, inefficient system, constantly being drained by the Cold War, could simply never meet.
And that leaves us with the big, lingering question at the heart of Parenti's analysis. Could a system that was born under constant attack from the outside and was so tangled up in its own counterproductive internal logic, could it ever really fix itself, or was it trapped from the very start?